When Dr. Yoshio Nishina arrived in Hiroshima on August 8, 1945, he expected to prove the Americans were lying about their atomic bomb. Instead, his radiation detectors recorded levels so high they broke his equipment, and the measurements he took would force him to admit something that haunted him until his death. Japan never understood the race it was running. 8:15 a.m., August 6, 1945. A flash brighter than 1,000 suns erased Hiroshima from the map. Within hours, fragmentary radio transmissions reached Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters. An entire city, 340,000 people had vanished. But the reports contained an impossibility. Reconnaissance pilots described seeing only 3B 29 seconds over the city before the explosion. Just 3 aircraft, not the hundreds required to level an entire metropolis. By evening, radio intercepts confirmed President Truman's announcement to the world. America had unleashed an atomic bomb. Japan's military command refused to believe it. The physics were impossible. Even their own nuclear research program, led by the nation's most brilliant physicist, Dr. Yoshio Nishina, had concluded that building such a weapon would require years of development, even for the resource-rich United States. 3 planes, 1 bomb, 1 city gone. The mathematics didn't work. The timeline didn't work. The sheer industrial capacity required to enrich uranium at weapons-grade scale, it would take a decade, maybe more. Nishina himself had told them this. He had shown them the calculations, walked them through the theoretical requirements, explained why Japan's own program had stalled after months of effort. But now Hiroshima was silent. 340,000 people, and the radios had gone dead. In the war room beneath the Imperial Palace, 90 feet below ground and encased in reinforced concrete, General Yoshijiro Umezu stared at reconnaissance photographs that made no sense. The blast pattern was wrong, too perfect, too complete. Conventional explosives scattered damage. Unevenly, buildings collapsed in chaotic patterns. Some structures survived while others burned. This was different. This was a circle of annihilation, radiating from a single point, as if God himself had pressed his thumb into the earth. "Propaganda," Admiral Soemu Toyoda said, his voice sharp with certainty. "The Americans firebombed the city and invented this atomic weapon story to break our will." But Umezu wasn't convinced. He had seen the intercepted transmissions, the American broadcast claiming a new era of warfare. He had read the preliminary reports from survivors: black rain, skin peeling away without burns, soldiers dying days later with no visible wounds. Someone had to go to Hiroshima. Someone had to measure the truth. And there was only one man in Japan who could tell them whether the impossible had become real. At dawn on August 7th, the summons came for Dr. Yoshio Nishina, and with it, the unspoken accusation that would define the rest of his life. "You told us this couldn't happen. Prove you were right. Or prove you failed us." Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. Dr. Yoshio Nishina was not a man accustomed to being wrong. At 54, he stood as Japan's undisputed authority on nuclear physics, a scientist whose credentials read like a who's who of European atomic research. He had studied quantum mechanics under Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, where the greatest minds of the 1,920 seconds gathered to unravel the atom's mysteries. He had worked alongside Werner Heisenberg, discussed theory with Albert Einstein, published papers that earned him recognition across the international physics community. When Nishina returned to Japan in 1929, he brought with him not just knowledge, but ambition. He built Japan's first cyclotron in 1937, a massive particle accelerator that stood as proof his nation could compete in cutting-edge science. He established the Institute of Physical and Chemical Research as a world-class facility. He trained a generation of Japanese physicists who looked to him not just as a mentor, but as the man who had bridged the gap between Japan and the West's scientific elite. When the military came asking about atomic weapons in 1940, Nishina was the obvious choice to lead the investigation. He assembled a team. He ran calculations. He studied uranium isotope separation, neutron multiplication, critical mass requirements. For 3 years, he pursued what the government called the NIGO project, Japan's attempt to unlock the atom's military potential. And in 1943, Nishina delivered his conclusion. An atomic bomb was theoretically possible, but practically unfeasible within any meaningful time frame. The uranium enrichment alone would require industrial facilities on a scale Japan simply didn't possess. Separating uranium-235 from uranium-238 demanded vast amounts of electricity, precision, manufacturing, and resources the nation couldn't spare while fighting a war on multiple fronts. Even if they solved the technical challenges, even if they built the necessary infrastructure, it would take years, perhaps a decade, to produce enough weapons-grade material for a single device. The Americans faced the same obstacles, Nishina told the Imperial Command. Possibly greater ones, given the complexity of coordinating such an effort across an ocean. His best estimate: the United States might achieve a working atomic weapon by 1947 or 1948 if they committed unprecedented resources to the project. Japan's leadership accepted his assessment without question. Why wouldn't they? Nishina had trained under Bohr. He had built a cyclotron. He understood nuclear fission as well as anyone alive. The war would be decided by conventional means, by spirit, by tactical brilliance, by Japan's willingness to sacrifice everything before surrendering. The atomic threat was theoretical, distant, a problem for some future conflict. Nishina believed this too. He had run the numbers himself. Now, on August 7th, 1945, he stood in his Tokyo laboratory, reading the summons that would force him to confront the possibility that every calculation had been catastrophically wrong. The order was brief, clinical. Report to Imperial General Headquarters immediately. Prepare instruments for radiation measurement. Depart for Hiroshima at dawn. Nishina set the paper down with hands that had suddenly gone cold. They weren't asking him to investigate. They were asking him to confirm his own failure, to measure the gap between what he had promised was impossible and what had actually occurred. To stand before the men who had trusted his expertise and admit that while he was telling them the Americans needed years, those same Americans were already building the bomb that would erase an entire city. He gathered his instruments in silence: Geiger counters, ionization chambers, sample containers, tools designed for laboratory work, for measuring background radiation and moderate exposure levels, tools that suddenly felt painfully inadequate for whatever awaited him in Hiroshima. The unspoken accusation hung in the air like smoke. You told us this couldn't happen, and tomorrow Nishina would have to prove whether that was true or whether he had failed his nation at the moment it needed him most. The flight to Hiroshima took 3 hours. Nishina spent most of it staring at his instruments, running mental calculations, preparing himself for what he might find. Nothing prepared him for what he saw through the aircraft window. At 9:45 a.m. on August 8th, as the military transport descended through gaps in the cloud cover, Nishina caught his first glimpse of what remained of Hiroshima. The city had become a desert. Where 340,000 people had lived 48 hours earlier, there was nothing but scorched earth stretching to the horizon in every direction. The devastation wasn't patchy or uneven like the firebombing raids Nishina had witnessed in Tokyo. This was total, complete, a perfect circle of annihilation radiating from a single point at the city's center. Buildings that once stood 3 and 4 stories high had been flattened to rubble. The only structures still standing were skeletal concrete frames stripped bare of walls, windows, roofs, everything but their steel bones. They rose from the wasteland like the ribs of some vast dead animal, blackened and broken. Dr. Takashi Hamada, a physicist from Osaka University who had joined the investigation team, pressed his face against the window beside Nishina. His voice came out barely above a whisper. This cannot be the work of explosives." No one contradicted him. The aircraft descended toward what had been Hiroshima's military airfield. The runway was warped, buckled by heat and pressure, but the pilots managed a rough landing at 10:20 a.m. The moment the cabin door opened, the smell hit them. Burnt wood, scorched metal, and something else, something organic and deeply wrong. Soldiers stationed at the airfield rushed forward to meet them, but Nishina immediately noticed something disturbing. Several men had patches of hair missing, irregular bald spots on otherwise full heads. Others wore bandages covering their arms and faces, though their uniforms showed no signs of combat damage. One young private stood to the side, vomiting into a bucket, his skin pale as paper, his hands trembling. "What happened to these men?" Nishina asked the commanding officer. The officer's face was grim. "They entered the city center 2 days ago to search for survivors. Since then, fevers, bleeding gums, hair loss. Our medics don't understand it. They have no external injuries, no burns, no wounds. But they're dying anyway." Nishina felt his stomach tighten. He had read about this in theoretical papers: radiation sickness, damage to rapidly dividing cells, the body's immune system and blood production shutting down from exposure to ionizing radiation. He was looking at radiation sickness in soldiers who had simply walked through the ruins. The team gathered their equipment and began the approach toward Ground Zero. Nishina held his notebook, but his hands trembled so badly he could barely write. With each step, the devastation became more complete. Skeletal buildings rose like broken teeth against the gray sky. Automobiles had been charred into twisted sculptures of blackened metal. Glass from thousands of windows had melted and pooled on the pavement like frozen water. Roof tiles had fused together in the heat, creating strange ceramic masses that no longer resembled anything human-made. Then Nishina saw something that stopped him cold. A stone wall, still partially standing near what had been a busy intersection. On its surface was a permanent silhouette, the shadow of a human being. The person had been standing there when the flash came, their body shielding the wall behind them from the thermal radiation. The heat had been so intense that it bleached the exposed stone while leaving this perfect outline, a nuclear shadow. Nishina had read theoretical papers describing this phenomenon. The temperature at ground level would need to exceed 7,000 degrees Celsius to create such an effect. Hot enough to vaporize human tissue instantly. Hot enough to burn shadows into stone. He knelt beside the shadow, his scientific instruments forgotten in his satchel. His breathing came shallow and quick. For the first time since receiving his orders, Nishina admitted to himself what he had been trying to deny since the moment he boarded the aircraft. No conventional weapon could do this. The Americans had achieved the impossible, and Japan had never understood the race it was running. If you enjoy dramatic, jaw-dropping stories, subscribe to World War II Archives Declassified. Let's grow this channel to 1,000 subscribers. At 11:30 a.m., Dr. Nishina began setting up his radiation detection equipment at the first measurement point, approximately 500 meters from what his calculations indicated was ground zero. He carefully calibrated the Geiger counter, his hands moving through the familiar motions of scientific procedure. The instrument was designed to measure background radiation and moderate exposure levels from laboratory work, standard scientific equipment, reliable, precise. It had never been intended for this. The moment he activated the counter, the needle slammed to the maximum reading and stayed there. Nishina stared at the gauge, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. He checked the calibration again, adjusted the settings, tested the battery. The needle didn't move. It remained pegged at the highest measurement the device could register. "Dr. Nishina?" one of the engineers called out. "What does it say?" Nishina's voice came out hollow. "The readings exceed the instrument's capacity. I cannot measure how high the radiation levels actually are." He moved to establish a grid pattern, taking measurements at carefully calibrated distances from the hypocenter. At each location, the same result: maximum readings. His instruments were useless. The radiation was so intense it had rendered his most sophisticated equipment into little more than decorative props. He began collecting soil samples instead, sealing them in lead-lined containers with trembling fingers. The residual radioactivity saturated everything: the soil, the debris, the very dust that hung in the air. Near what had been a residential neighborhood, Nishina discovered areas where witnesses reported the black rain had fallen. He took samples from the contaminated soil and compared them to areas that had remained dry. The difference was staggering. The black rain zones showed radiation levels more than 20 times higher than the surrounding areas. The oily black precipitation that survivors described wasn't just rain. It was radioactive fallout fission products that had condensed in the atmosphere and fallen back to Earth, carrying death in every drop. While Nishina worked, the engineering team examined the structural damage. One engineer called him over to inspect a reinforced concrete wall that remained partially standing. The blast pressure had warped the steel reinforcement bars inside the concrete, bent them like they were made of clay. "Dr. Nishina," the engineer said, running calculations in his notebook. "The pressure required to bend structural steel like this, it exceeds anything conventional explosives could produce. We're looking at forces equivalent to multiple tons of TNT, all released from a single point in the air." At 1:15 p.m., Major Kushi Yamashita approached Nishina with an ashen face. "We've begun the autopsies," the medical officer said quietly. "You need to see this." Nishina followed him to a makeshift morgue established in one of the few buildings with a roof still intact. Inside, Army doctors worked over bodies of victims who had died without any visible external injuries. These people had been far enough from the blast to avoid burns or trauma, yet they had died anyway, within hours or days of the explosion. One doctor looked up as Nishina entered. "We've only read about this in foreign journals, theoretical papers on radiation exposure. The autopsy findings painted a horrifying picture. The victims' stomachs looked as though they had been scoured with wire brushes. Every passage of the intestinal tract was clogged with blood. The bone marrow showed signs of catastrophic damage, the body's blood-producing cells destroyed at the cellular level. This is acute radiation syndrome," Nishina said, his voice barely audible. "Damage to rapidly dividing cells, the gastrointestinal lining, the bone marrow, the hair follicles." Major Yamashita nodded grimly. "Some victims who seemed healthy immediately after the explosion began dying 3 to 5 days later. The same symptoms every time: vomiting, bleeding gums, hair loss, then death." Nishina stepped outside, needing air. The scientific part of his mind catalogued the evidence methodically. Maximum radiation readings at multiple measurement points. Thermal effects consistent with temperatures exceeding 7,000 degrees Celsius. Blast pressure warping structural steel. Radioactive fallout contamination. Acute radiation syndrome in victims with no external injuries. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same impossible conclusion. This was fission. Pure nuclear fission. The splitting of uranium atoms, releasing energy from the very fabric of matter itself. But another part of his mind, the human part, was beginning to crack under the weight of what he was witnessing. The Americans hadn't just built an atomic bomb. They had built it years ahead of schedule. They had solved problems Nishina thought would take a decade. They had industrialized uranium enrichment on a scale he never imagined possible. And Japan had never seen it coming. Nishina walked without direction through the ruins, needing distance from the autopsy room, from the clinical measurements, from the methodical documentation of horror. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the devastation. Somewhere in the distance, fires still burned small blazes, feeding on whatever combustible material remained in a city that had already been consumed by fire beyond imagination. His feet carried him down what had once been a residential street. The houses were gone, all of them. not damaged or burned, simply erased. Only their foundations remained, rectangular outlines in the scorched earth, marking where families had lived their ordinary lives. That's when he saw it. A child's tricycle, or what remained of one. The metal frame had melted and fused with the pavement, the steel warped and twisted by heat that had exceeded anything conventional fire could produce. The rubber tires had vaporized completely, leaving only the wheel rims pressed into the ground. The handlebars were bent at an impossible angle, as if the metal itself had been caught mid-scream, and beneath it, pressed into the scorched earth, was a small impression, the outline where a child had been sitting when the flash came. Nishina knelt beside the tricycle. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. A child had been riding this. A child who had no understanding of nuclear physics or uranium isotopes or critical mass. A child who didn't know what a cyclotron was, who had never heard of Niels Bohr or quantum mechanics or the binding energy that held atomic nuclei together. A child who had simply been pedaling down the street on an ordinary August morning. The shadow on the wall had been abstract, a silhouette, an outline, something his scientific mind could catalog and measure. But this tricycle was different. This spoke of motion interrupted, of momentum stopped mid-pedal, of a small body caught in the act of being a child, frozen forever in the moment before the heat turned flesh to vapor. Nishina's vision blurred. He pulled out his field notebook with hands that could barely hold the pen. He needed to write something, some observation, some measurement, some piece of data that would make sense of what he was witnessing. Instead, he wrote a single line, words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Americans have achieved what we believed impossible. But beneath that, his hand moved almost without conscious thought, adding words he would never share in any official report. And I never warned them in time. He sat there in the ruins, a brilliant physicist who had spent his entire career trying to unlock the atom's secrets, who had studied under the greatest minds of his generation, who had built Japan's first cyclotron, who had advised emperors and generals, now confronted with the terrible reality of what those secrets meant when weaponized against children riding tricycles. The measurements told a story his training forced him to accept: uranium-235 fission, thermal radiation exceeding 7,000 degrees Celsius, blast pressure consistent with kiloton yield detonation, residual gamma radiation saturating the environment. But the tricycle told a different story, a story about the cost of being wrong, about the distance between theory and reality, about what it meant to measure the exact moment your nation's understanding of the world proved catastrophically inadequate. Nishina had told his government the Americans were years away from achieving this. He had shown them calculations. He had walked them through the technical barriers, the uranium enrichment challenges, the precision manufacturing requirements, the sheer industrial scale necessary to produce weapons-grade material. He had been so certain. His confidence had been built on decades of expertise, on intimate knowledge of nuclear physics, on first-hand experience with how difficult this technology was to master. And he had been wrong about everything. The child on the tricycle had paid the price for his certainty, along with 70,000 others who had died instantly, and the thousands more who would die in the coming days and weeks, their bodies destroyed by radiation they couldn't see, couldn't feel, couldn't understand. Nishina remained kneeling beside the tricycle as the sun sank lower in the sky. Around him, his team continued their work, taking measurements, collecting samples, documenting evidence, doing what scientists do when confronted with the incomprehensible. They measure it, categorize it, attempt to contain it within the bounds of human understanding. But some things resist containment. Some moments are too large to fit inside equations. When Nishina finally stood, his legs trembling beneath him, he understood with devastating clarity what he would have to do next. He would have to return to Tokyo. He would have to stand before the men who had trusted his expertise. He would have to deliver the truth that would shatter every assumption Japan's leadership held about this war, about American capabilities, about the very nature of modern conflict. He would have to admit that while he was reassuring them the race was still winnable, the Americans had already crossed the finish line. And somewhere in the ruins around him, countless other tricycles lay buried beneath the rubble, silent testimony to the cost of expertise that proved catastrophically insufficient. At 6:45 p.m. on August 8th, the survey team gathered in what remained of a schoolhouse on the outskirts of Hiroshima. The building had lost its roof and most of its western wall, but the concrete structure still stood one of the few shelters available in the devastated city. Dr. Nishina sat at a battered desk while the others arranged their findings on makeshift tables. The evening light cast long shadows through the broken walls. The chief engineer spread out diagrams across the table, careful measurements of the destruction pattern radiating from a single point approximately 600 meters above the city center. An aerial burst, he explained. The blast wave traveled outward in all directions with equal force. Buildings directly beneath the detonation point had their roofs driven straight down. Structures to the sides were pushed outward. Another engineer added, the thermal radiation was so intense it carbonized wooden structures instantly before the blast wave even reached them. We found shadows burned into stone walls where human bodies blocked the light. The temperature at ground level exceeded 7,000 degrees Celsius. Major Yamashita presented the medical findings, his voice clinical, the only way to discuss what they had witnessed without breaking. We performed autopsies on 17 victims who died without external injuries. All showed identical symptoms consistent with acute radiation syndrome, destruction of the gastrointestinal lining, bone marrow damage, hemorrhaging in multiple organ systems. We've also documented hundreds of cases among survivors and rescue workers: vomiting, hair loss, bleeding gums, unexplained fevers. The room fell silent as the weight of the evidence settled over them. Nishina opened his notebook and began writing the official report. His hand moved across the page with mechanical precision, decades of scientific training overriding the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. Based on systematic analysis of physical evidence, radiation measurements, and medical documentation, this device is confirmed as an atomic bomb. The words looked almost mundane on paper, simple, clinical, but they represented the collapse of everything Japan's leadership had believed about the war, about American capabilities, about the very nature of modern warfare. At 8:20 p.m., a military courier arrived with access to secure communications back to Tokyo. Before sending the official telegram, Nishina requested a direct line to Hisatsune Sakomizu, the cabinet secretary. The conversation was arranged through crackling radio connections. Nishina stood alone in a corner of the ruined schoolhouse, the handset pressed to his ear, knowing that what he said next would echo through Japanese history. "Mr. Secretary," Nishina began, his voice trembling despite his efforts to control it, "I must report that Hiroshima was destroyed by an atomic bomb. There is no doubt. The evidence is irrefutable." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, Nishina said the words that had been building inside him since he knelt beside that melted tricycle. "We scientists must apologize to the nation for our incompetence." The confession hung in the air. Nishina, the father of modern physics in Japan, the man who had studied alongside the world's greatest scientists, the brilliant mind who had built the nation's first cyclotron, was admitting that he had failed his country at its moment of greatest need. "We told you the Americans were years away from achieving this," Nishina continued. "We were wrong, catastrophically wrong. While we struggled to produce grams of uranium hexafluoride, they were producing it by the ton. We never understood the scale of what they were capable of." The official telegram was sent at 9:05 p.m. in Tokyo, 90 feet below the Imperial Palace. The message arrived at the War Room at 9:53 p.m. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki read it twice, then set it down on the table with hands that had aged years in a single day. He looked at the assembled military leadership men who had prosecuted this war with absolute conviction that Japanese spirit could overcome American industrial might. "Gentlemen," Suzuki said quietly, "this is not a defeat of our armed forces. This is a defeat of our science and technology by American technology. The military should not speak of prestige." Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Chief of the Naval General Staff, refused to accept the conclusion. His voice was sharp, defensive. "One bomb. They cannot possibly have more than 1 or 2 additional devices ready. We can endure the remaining attacks and continue the fight." "Endure?" Suzuki's voice carried an edge of disbelief. "You propose we endure more of this? Our soldiers are prepared to die for the Emperor." "Die for what?" Suzuki interrupted. "Admiral, Dr. Nishina reports that people are dying from simply walking through the ruins. This weapon kills days after the explosion. It poisons the soil. It makes entire cities uninhabitable." But Toyota wasn't listening. Neither were the others. Nishina could see it in their responses, read it in the messages that came back through the courier. They acknowledged the weapon's power. They accepted that Hiroshima had been destroyed by atomic fission. But they could not, would not accept what it meant. Back in the ruined schoolhouse, Nishina stood staring at the darkening sky. He had sent his telegram. He had delivered the truth. He had apologized for his failure. And still, they would not listen. On August 9th, Dr. Nishina remained in Hiroshima, documenting a horror that was still unfolding. The bomb had detonated 3 days earlier, but people were still dying. Not from burns or blast injuries, those victims had died immediately. These new deaths were different, more insidious. Civilians and soldiers who had entered the city center on August 7th and 8th to search for survivors were now collapsing with identical symptoms. At first, they seemed fine. Then came the vomiting, violent and uncontrollable. Within hours, their gums began bleeding spontaneously. Some developed fevers that climbed to fatal levels. Others watched helplessly as their skin began sloughing off in sheets, as though their bodies were rejecting their own tissue. Major Yamashita brought Nishina to observe a rescue worker who had spent less than 6 hours in the hypocenter area on August 7th. The man lay on a makeshift cot, his hair falling out in clumps, purple bruises spreading across his skin where blood vessels were rupturing beneath the surface. "He has no external wounds," Yamashita said quietly. "He was never closer than half a kilometer from ground zero. Yet he's dying." Nishina knelt beside the man, taking notes with mechanical precision, even as his hands shook. The symptoms matched everything he knew about radiation exposure: damage to cells that divide rapidly, destruction of the immune system, catastrophic failure of the body's ability to produce new blood cells. That afternoon, Nishina drafted an urgent warning to be sent to Tokyo. The danger persists long after detonation. Residual radiation in soil and debris continues to sicken and kill those who enter the affected area. Immediate evacuation of all personnel from the city center is imperative. The weapon's effects are not limited to the moment of explosion. The response from Imperial headquarters arrived at 4:30 p.m. The High Command had reviewed his findings. They acknowledged the devastating power of the atomic bomb. But Admiral Toyota and other military leaders had reached a calculated conclusion. America could not possibly possess more than 1 or 2 additional weapons. Japan would endure whatever remained and continue fighting. Nishina read the message with growing desperation. He immediately requested another secure communication line to Tokyo. "You do not understand this weapon," Nishina pleaded when the connection was established. "This is not a larger conventional bomb. This represents a fundamental change in warfare. If America can produce 1 atomic bomb, they can produce more. Their industrial capacity—" "Dr. Nishina," came the cold response from a staff officer. "We appreciate your scientific assessment. The strategic decisions will be made by military command." The line went dead. Nishina stood in the ruined schoolhouse, the handset still in his hand, feeling the weight of his own powerlessness. He had measured the radiation. He had documented the deaths. He had delivered the truth. And still, they would not listen. At 11:02 a.m., on August 9th, a second atomic bomb detonated over Nagasaki. The news reached Nishina's team at 1:15 p.m. A courier arrived with a fragmentary radio transmission. Another city destroyed. Another single flash. Another mushroom cloud rising into the stratosphere. Nishina sat down heavily on a piece of rubble, the telegram trembling in his hands. They had 2. At least 2. And if they had 2, they could have more. His prediction, the one the military had dismissed just hours earlier, had been confirmed in the most terrible way possible. The 3 pillars that had supported all of Japan's war planning suddenly revealed themselves as nothing more than wishful thinking built on sand. Distance irrelevant, when a single aircraft could carry a bomb that destroyed an entire city. Morale and fighting spirit meaningless when the enemy possessed weapons that could vaporize soldiers before they even knew they were under attack. Tactical superiority. What tactics could defend against a weapon that created temperatures of 7,000 degrees Celsius and left radiation in the soil for days, weeks, perhaps years afterward? Japan had been fighting one war while America had been developing the capacity to fight an entirely different kind of conflict. A conflict where all the old rules, all the assumptions about acceptable losses and strategic advantage had become obsolete in an instant. That evening, as Nishina packed his instruments to return to Tokyo, he understood with devastating clarity what he had actually accomplished in Hiroshima. He had not merely measured radiation levels in contaminated soil. He had not simply confirmed the existence of an atomic weapon. He had measured the exact moment when a nation's illusions shattered against the hard edge of reality. Every calculation Japan's military had made about enduring losses, outlasting American will, compensating for industrial disadvantage through superior spirit, all of it had been based on assumptions that no longer applied. The atomic bomb had not just destroyed two cities. It had destroyed the very framework through which Japan understood modern warfare. And Nishina had been the one forced to deliver that truth, the scientist who had to tell his nation that everything they believed was wrong, and that he himself had failed to see it coming until it was far too late. Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945. Dr. Yoshio Nishina returned to Tokyo to find his laboratory damaged by conventional bombing raids, his research materials scattered, and his life's work reduced to surviving in a nation that had lost everything, including its illusions about itself. In the months following the surrender, Nishina threw himself into rebuilding Japan's scientific community. He worked with younger physicists, attempting to salvage what remained of the country's research infrastructure. He wrote papers documenting what he had observed in Hiroshima, knowing that future generations would need to understand what atomic weapons could do. He never spoke about the tricycle, but the occupation forces had other plans. On November 24th, 1945, American military personnel arrived at Nishina's laboratory with orders to dismantle Japan's cyclotrons, the very machines he had built to study nuclear physics, the instruments that represented Japan's attempt to understand atomic power. Nishina stood silently as soldiers used blowtorches to cut apart the cyclotrons piece by piece. The massive electromagnets that had taken years to construct were reduced to scrap metal. The vacuum chambers were broken open. Everything was loaded onto trucks and driven to Tokyo Bay. He watched from the shore as they dumped the pieces into the water. Those machines represented more than scientific equipment. They were the tools that might have helped Japan understand nuclear fission earlier. That might have given Japanese scientists the knowledge to accurately assess American capabilities. That might have warned the nation what was coming before Hiroshima became a test case for atomic warfare. Now they sank beneath the waves, taking with them any possibility of what might have been. Nishina never spoke about that day either, but those who knew him said something in his eyes changed after watching his cyclotrons disappear into Tokyo Bay, a light that went out and never returned. In the years that followed, those close to Nishina noticed the weight he carried. He rarely spoke about Hiroshima, but the guilt was evident in his silences. in the way his hands would shake when the subject arose, in his tireless efforts to rebuild Japanese science, as though compensating for a debt he could never repay. Friends later recalled that he never forgave himself for not understanding sooner, for not warning his nation more forcefully about American scientific capacity, for being the one who had to stand in Hiroshima's ruins and confirm what his government had refused to believe. "If I had known," he said once to a colleague, his voice barely audible, "if I had only known what they were capable of." But he had not known. None of them had. The measurements Nishina took in those 24 hours in Hiroshima remain among the most historically significant scientific observations ever recorded. They were the first systematic study of radiation from an atomic weapon used in warfare. They confirmed what the world feared and what Japan had denied until confronted with irrefutable evidence. They marked the moment when theoretical physics became terrible reality. Dr. Yoshio Nishina died on January 10, 1951, at the age of 60. The official cause was liver cancer, though some who knew him believed he had been dying slowly since August 8, 1945, the day he stood in the ruins of Hiroshima and confirmed what his nation had refused to believe. His funeral was attended by hundreds of students, colleagues, scientists who had worked under his guidance. They spoke of his brilliance, his dedication to Japanese physics, his role in bringing modern atomic theory to their nation. No one mentioned the apology he had made over a crackling radio line in a ruined schoolhouse. No one spoke of the telegram he had sent, admitting that Japan's greatest physicist had been catastrophically wrong about the race his nation was running. No one talked about the child's tricycle, or the nuclear shadow on the wall, or the rescue workers dying from invisible radiation days after they thought themselves safe. Some truths are too heavy to speak aloud, even at funerals. Nishina had spent his entire career trying to unlock the atom's secrets. He had studied under the greatest minds of his generation. He had built Japan's first cyclotron. He had advised emperors and generals on the future of nuclear physics. And in the end, he became the man who had to stand in the ashes of Hiroshima and measure not just radiation levels, but the exact moment when humanity crossed into the atomic age, an age his nation had entered too late to understand and too broken to survive unchanged. The radiation readings he recorded that day were precise, methodical, scientific, but they could never measure the true cost of what he had witnessed. The cost of expertise that proved inadequate, the cost of confidence built on incomplete information, the cost of warning a nation about dangers it refused to believe until the evidence was written in shadow and ash across an entire city, the cost of being right too late and wrong when it mattered most. In his final years, when colleagues asked about his time in Hiroshima, Nishina would simply shake his head and turn away. Some measurements, he had learned, break the instruments designed to record them. Some truths are too large to fit inside equations. And some moments, like kneeling beside a melted tricycle in the ruins of a vaporized city, resist all attempts at scientific categorization. They can only be carried silently until the weight of them becomes too much to bear. The final report on Hiroshima's radiation levels painted a picture of devastation that would haunt scientists for generations. Victims at Ground Zero had absorbed radiation doses exceeding 9 grays, nearly 20 times the lethal dose. Their bodies had been subjected to radiation levels so intense that death was instantaneous, though the radiation itself killed more slowly than the heat and blast. The residual radiation measurements Nishina's team had taken revealed something equally disturbing. In the first 60 days after the bombing, the maximum cumulative dose from lingering contamination was estimated at 4.2 Roentgens, more than enough to cause radiation sickness in anyone who spent extended time in the ruins. The thermal radiation had exceeded 7,000 degrees Celsius at ground level, temperatures hot enough to vaporize human tissue and leave only shadows burned into stone. Those permanent silhouettes would remain for decades, silent testimony to the moment when nuclear fire swept across a city. 10% of Hiroshima's deaths were from radiation alone, not from the blast, not from the fires, from invisible rays that destroyed the body from within, that lingered in soil and debris, that killed rescue workers days after they thought themselves safe. 70,000 people had died instantly on August 6th. By the end of 1945, the death toll exceeded 140,000. The weapon had killed in ways that conventional bombs never could. But statistics alone cannot capture what Dr. Yoshio Nishina measured in Hiroshima. He measured the moment when humanity's understanding of warfare became obsolete, when the calculus of acceptable losses and strategic advantage collapsed under the weight of a single device that could erase a city in an instant. He measured the gap between what the world's leading physicists believed was possible and what industrial-scale science could actually achieve when nations committed their full resources to unlocking the atom's military potential. He measured the cost of confidence built on incomplete information, the terrible price paid when expertise proves catastrophically insufficient at the moment it matters most. And he measured something else, something that couldn't be quantified in grays or Roentgens or degrees Celsius. He measured the exact moment when theoretical physics stopped being an abstract, intellectual pursuit and became an irreversible reality written in shadow and ash across an entire city. The nuclear shadows remain in Hiroshima today, preserved behind glass, protected from weathering, maintained as evidence of what happened when humanity first weaponized the binding energy that holds atomic nuclei together. Tourists photograph them. School children study them in textbooks. They have become historical artifacts, museum pieces, symbols of a moment when the world changed forever. But they were once people, living, breathing human beings who happened to be standing in the wrong place when the flash came, their final moments preserved, not in memory or monument, but in the permanent alteration of stone by thermal radiation that shouldn't exist outside the core of stars. Dr. Nishina knew their names would never be recorded. Their stories would never be told. They would exist only as shadows, evidence of the moment when theory became reality, when calculation became catastrophe, when the race Japan didn't understand, it was running, ended with the finish line drawn, in radioactive ash across 2 cities. In the end, Nishina's greatest achievement wasn't building Japan's first cyclotron or studying under Niels Bohr or advancing the nation's understanding of quantum mechanics. It was this. He became the first person to systematically measure atomic warfare in reality rather than theory. He documented what nuclear weapons actually do when used against cities full of people. He confirmed that the carefully constructed equations and theoretical models his generation of physicists had developed were not abstract intellectual exercises. They were blueprints for a new kind of violence that humanity was utterly unprepared to control. His measurements told the truth that Japan's leadership didn't want to hear, that distance, morale, and tactical skill had become meaningless in an instant, that the old rules of war had been rewritten by science operating at a scale no one had imagined possible, that humanity had crossed a line it could never uncross. Today, nearly 80 years after Nishina knelt beside that melted tricycle in Hiroshima's ruins, his radiation readings remain archived in scientific journals and historical records. Precise, clinical, methodical. They document exposure levels and contamination patterns and thermal radiation effects with the detached language of scientific inquiry. But they cannot document what it meant to be the man taking those measurements, to be the expert who had reassured his nation that atomic weapons were years away, only to discover you were catastrophically wrong, to kneel beside the shadow of a child and realize that your failure of understanding had contributed to a weapon being used before anyone, including you, understood what it would actually do, to measure not just radiation, but the moment when scientific achievement revealed itself as humanity's capacity for destruction, operating at a scale previously reserved for natural disasters and acts of God. Nishina spent his final years trying to rebuild what the war had destroyed, carrying knowledge that few others possessed. He had seen what atomic weapons do when theory becomes reality. He had measured the exact moment when humanity stepped into an age it was unprepared to survive. And he knew, with the clarity that comes from standing in radioactive ruins, that the race hadn't ended in Hiroshima. It had only just begun. The shadows remain, the measurements endure, and the question Nishina could never answer the question that haunted him until his death remains unanswered still. What do we do now that we know what we're capable of? The atomic age didn't begin with Einstein's equation or the first chain reaction in Chicago, or even the Trinity test in New Mexico. It began the moment Dr. Yoshio Nishina's radiation detectors broke, trying to measure what humanity had unleashed. And we've been living in the shadow of that moment ever since. Don't just watch, subscribe. Help World Wardus Archives Declassified. Hit 000 subscribers.